Up to this point, we've assumed that utility is measurable in terms of money. Of course, utility isn't measurable, so now what we want to do is address the problem of measurement and how to solve it. Remember the principle of diminishing marginal utility, the idea that as you consume more of a good, the utility from one more unit declines? Well, let's connect this to income. It would imply that $1 of income means more to a poor person than to a rich person. The poor person uses his last dollar to buy a hamburger, clothing, and perhaps a small toy for his kids. The rich person uses his last dollar to buy caviar, minks, and sports cars. We can illustrate this as follows. We have two individuals, Jack and Jill. Jack is quite poor, indicated by an income of OA. The marginal utility of income for Jack is the vertical distance from the horizontal axis to the marginal utility curve. Jill's income, on the other hand, is measured from OD. Because she has so much, the marginal utility of the last dollar earned is quite low. If $1 means more to Jack than to Jill, we can increase social welfare by redistributing income. Let's take CD of income from Jill and give it to Jack, increasing his income from A to B. Why does social welfare go up? Because the decline in the rich person's happiness is outweighed by the increase in the poor person's.
Historical Moments with John Watkins, Ph.D.
In the early 20th century, Lionel Robbins questioned the validity of the cardinality assumption, the belief that utility is measurable and additive. Doubts about the cardinality of utility were heightened by arguments about the redistribution of income. This is a powerful argument, an argument that disturbed Robbins and other economists. Utilitarianism had long been used to justify laissez-faire. Now it was being used as an argument for government intervention, the same type of intervention advocated by many socialists. Robbins was able to dismiss the validity of the argument by pointing out that it required making interpersonal utility comparisons. In other words, to believe it, you had to compare states of mind. The problem is that there is not an objective way to compare subjective feeling. We can't say that $1 to one person means more than $1 to another. Arguments based on such assumptions lost credibility, and economists look for new ways to understand human choice. What emerged was the concept of ordinal utility, the idea that we only need to know how individuals rank various alternatives. Assigning numbers to these alternatives is unnecessary.
Although we can't measure utility, policymakers do a variant of it all the time. It's called cost-benefit analysis. Let's take an example. Salt Lake's freeways are becoming congested. Currently, there are plans to widen I-15 from 3 lanes to 5 lanes on each side. Is this a good plan or not, and how should we evaluate it? Well, we begin by making some assumptions about the benefits of expanding I-15 and comparing them with the costs. What are the benefits? They include the increased speed with which commuters can travel from home to work, the reduction of smog from having fewer cars idling in gridlock, the decrease in gas consumption, the decline in accidents, and so on. Of course, economists will have to put these benefits into numbers, and they'll have to have some idea of the number of cars that travel per hour and how those numbers are increasing. Well, what are the costs? The obvious costs are the cost of widening the highway, the delays involved, the cost of the asphalt, gravel, and so on, the cost of the labor, the purchase of the land, and the compensation to businesses and individuals for purchasing their land. But what if Mr. Smith has lived in that house all his life? He was born there and his father before him. An official asks, what can the state do to compensate him to induce him to move? Mr. Smith responds, there's no amount of money. What then? Theoretically, the costs would exceed the benefits and the project shouldn't go forth. But in fact, it doesn't happen this way. The state pays the fair market value. That value compensates for the value of the land and the residents, but it doesn't compensate for the emotional pain. In effect, the state is making an interpersonal utility comparison. It's saying that the benefits to the community outweigh the costs to those individuals who are displaced. Given we can't measure utility or happiness, where does that leave us in terms of the theory of consumer choice? Well, economists found that from a theoretical perspective, there is no reason to measure utility. All we need to know is an individual's preference rankings, and we express it by simple ordering, thus the name of ordinal utility. The following graph makes it clear. First, note that we have three axes: sprite on one axis, spam on another, and utility on another. We assume that utility is a function of spam and sprite. The more spam and sprite that I consume, the happier or the more utility I have. How do we indicate this? We show utility as a mountain. As I consume more spam and sprite, I become ever happier. Higher and higher up the mountain I go. Notice, though, that if I stop on the mountain, I may choose to move in either one way or the other without changing my elevation. In other words, I can consume different combinations of spam or sprite without altering the level of utility. This contour line, in effect, is what we call an indifference curve, and we can take this indifference curve to represent it in two-dimensional space. An indifference curve is just like a contour line on a topographical map. A contour line shows the same elevation on a mountain. An indifference curve shows us the same level of utility. With this in mind, we can derive an indifference curve as follows. It shows the different combinations of goods that an individual may consume, leaving utility unchanged. All along an indifference curve, a consumer is indifferent to various combinations of goods. In fact, we can identify a number of indifference curves, an infinite number, but for our purposes, we'll show only three. These indifference curves make up what we call an indifference map, which would be a complete set of indifference curves, just like a topo map. But what about the shape of the curves? Why do they look the way they do? Indifference curves have three characteristics. First, they're downward sloping. As you consume more spam, you consume less sprite. Why? Because if you consumed more spam, consuming the same amount of sprite, utility in fact would increase. This stems from the assumption that more is always preferred to less. The slope of an indifference curve is called the marginal rate of substitution. It reveals the willingness of a consumer to substitute one commodity for another. Second, indifference curves are bowed or convex to the origin. This, in fact, reflects the assumption of the diminishing marginal rate of substitution, or less formally, diminishing marginal utility. The idea is this: if we give up equal amounts of sprite, we have to get increasing amounts of spam to keep us just as well off. Why? Because if we have less sprite, the marginal utility of sprite increases. As we get more spam, the marginal utility of spam decreases. Third, indifference curves can't intersect. Well, why is that? Because if they did, you in fact would not be rational. Let's explain this. Let us assume for the moment that indifference curves intersect. Notice our points. By definition, Heather is indifferent between points X and Y. She is also indifferent between Y and Z for the same reasons. So if X is indifferent to Y and Y is indifferent to Z, then X and Z must be indifferent to each other. This is the principle of transitivity. But the other assumption that more is always preferred to less, so X is preferred to Z. So to avoid that sort of contradiction, we require that indifference curves don't cross.
Blah, blah, blah.
The budget or income constraint defines the sets of goods and services that we can afford. We'll review the budget line and then show how we can use indifference curves to solve our consumer decision problem. The budget line, or the constraint, shows the different combinations of goods that an individual can purchase, holding prices and money income constant. The slope of the budget line shows the relative prices of goods. So if the price of games is $30 and the price of CDs is $15, the slope of the line is -2. And that means for every game you purchase, you have to give up 2 CDs. The distance from the origin reflects the income and defines the attainable set, what you can purchase with your income. With a budget of $60, the effect of the decline in the price of CDs from $15 to $12 means that Heather could purchase more if she spent all her money on CDs. So the budget line swings out. Similarly, if the price of CDs were suddenly to rise to, say, $30, Heather could only purchase 2. In this case, the budget line swings in, and Heather can purchase at most 2 CDs. The effect of a decrease in the price of games to $20 has a similar effect, keeping CDs priced at our original level of $15 each. In this case, the other end of the budget line swings out, and that indicates that we can purchase more of them. And if the price of games rises to $40, the budget line would swing in, indicating that if the price rises, we would have to purchase less. An increase in income, holding prices constant, shifts the budget line outward, indicating that you could purchase more goods. The consumer's objective is to maximize utility given the budget constraint. This means reaching the highest or the farthest away from the origin indifference curve given a limited income. Each indifference curve represents combinations of goods which yield identical levels of satisfaction. Using our example from above, all we have to do is superimpose an indifference map. As we move along the budget line from point A to point B, we move up in terms of utility from indifference curve 1 to curve 2. If we keep on moving, we'll start going back down the utility hill. So our solution is to allocate our income $60 by purchasing 1 game for $30 and 2 CDs at $15 each. In this example, we'll assume Heather can buy either 1/2 a game or 1 CD for $15. The marginal utilities for games and CDs are shown in the second and fourth columns. The last 2 columns show marginal utility per dollar. In spending her first $15, Heather gets more utils per dollar by buying a game, 8 versus 7. And after she buys the game, she has $45 left. How should she spend her next $15? Well, she could buy another 1/2 a game and get 5 utils per dollar, or buy her first CD, which gives her 7 utils of happiness per dollar. So she buys her first CD and now has $30 left. Well, if we continue, how should she spend her next $15? Well, this time it doesn't matter. She gets the same level of satisfaction from either another 1/2 a game or her second CD. Assume she buys the second half of the game. Now, with only $15 left, she could either go for another 1/2 a game, which gives her 2 utils per dollar, or buy her second CD, which gives her 5 utils. The rational choice is to buy another CD, which maximizes her happiness and exhausts her budget. At this combination, the marginal utility per dollar is the same for both games and CDs. The indifference curve is tangent to the budget line. So we know the marginal utility of games divided by the marginal utility of CDs, which is equal to the marginal rate of substitution, which is equal to the slope of the indifference curve. If you'll recall from earlier, a consumer maximizes utility by equalizing the marginal utility per dollar from each good. If you can get more utility by switching from consumption of one good to consumption of another good, you'll switch until you can't do this anymore. So we can write the marginal rate of substitution is equal to the ratio of the marginal utility of games to the marginal utility of CDs, and that must be equal to the price of games divided by the price of CDs.
Price certainly is a factor, and depending on the community and depending on the target market, it can be a very large contributor to the success of a program. If you're a food service product in Salt Lake City, you can do pretty well with a low price and convincing a lot of large families who spend a lot of large percentage of their spendable income for religious purposes to convince them to come out on occasion and buy your product. You can do very, very well here. But price, to the generation that exists now, it's almost to where non-rational spending to a certain degree can actually be a socially enhanced product description. For example, it was recently you could buy a home for the same price that you can buy a Lexus. You can't sleep in a Lexus. You can't shower in a Lexus. You can't even resell it for the same value. It has no, but yet it's a status symbol. And so it's almost this, I have enough money that I can spend ridiculously or lavishly in this particular area is very, 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 very important to some people. Gap kids, for example. I don't know any 2-year-old or 1-year-old that gives a darn about whether they're wearing Oshkosh purple jumpsuits that cost $48 that are color coordinated with yellow 100% cotton shirts that match beautifully, but the parents of those children, when they take them out, use that as an example to say, see, I'm a good parent, I take care of my children, I want them to be nice, I want the best for them, etc., etc. And as a result of that, you can make appeals to those that have absolutely nothing to do with price at all. In fact, you could buy a lot of those clothes. If you wanted to do an objective sampling, you could buy a lot of those types of clothes at, say, for example, a Sears or a JCPenney at a greater price. Now, you would have to wade through a lot of things that you probably wouldn't ever consider putting your child in, but you can find those types of items. But no, you wouldn't be caught putting that 2-year-old in an inexpensive Sears jumpsuit, unless, of course, you couldn't afford it. But that would be admitting something that you don't want to admit to people. So price doesn't necessarily have all that much to do with things. It does. It certainly plays a role, and it's part of the overall market mix. But it is not exclusive. It is not exclusive. The consumer doesn't always win those production battles.
It's time once again for Smart Guy, Dumb Guy.
Whoa, wow. Run that by me again, man. I think I missed something.
What a surprise. I said that the equilibrium condition for maximizing utility occurs when the last dollar spent on a good yields the same satisfaction as the last dollar spent on another good. Okay, the marginal utility per dollar has to be the same.
There's no way I'm going to get this.
Okay, let's say that a dollar spent on pizza yields less satisfaction than the last dollar spent on beer.
Okay, so?
Well, the idea is that you try to get the ratio of benefit to cost the same for the last dollar spent on various items. If the ratios differ, if you get more happiness from the last dollar spent on pizza than you did from the last dollar spent on beer, then by spending more on pizza and less on beer, it would increase utility. Why? Well, think of dollars spent as pleasure.
Oh, yeah. I like pleasure. I want all I can get.
Of course you do.
Yeah. So, if a dollar spent on pizza yields more satisfaction than the last dollar spent on beer, don't tell me. I should take the beer back, get my dollar back, and spend that dollar on pizza. I mean, that increases my pleasure, isn't that it?
Exactly.
So, if I have a dollar that yields me more pleasure by purchasing one good than another, I should buy more of it.
Yes.
And if I have a dollar that gives me less pleasure on one good, I should buy less?
Exactly. Oh, man. Well, where are you going?
I gotta take my pizza back, man. I don't like vegetarian. My marginal utilities are all out of whack, if you catch my drift.
How do we derive a demand curve? Under cardinal utility, deriving a demand curve is easy. If $1 equals 1 util, the diminishing marginal utility curve becomes the demand curve. But under ordinal utility, deriving a demand curve is a little bit more difficult. All we have to do, though, is to allow the price of, say, the product, like a pizza, to fall. What happens? The budget line swings out. The consumer is able to buy more product, pizzas, with the same income. So consumer equilibrium moves from point X to point Z. By drawing a line between point X and Z, we can derive a price consumption curve. A price consumption curve is defined as follows. a set of consumer equilibrium points resulting from a change in price holding money income constant. From this, we can derive a demand curve. In the graph below, we have the price of pizza on the vertical axis and the quantity of pizza on the horizontal axis. Note that at a price of $2, Heather, for example, is willing to buy 4 pizzas. At a price of $1, she is willing to buy 8. Marking the corresponding points, then connect them, and what do we have? A demand curve. A price change results in 2 effects that can be separated out for the purposes of analysis. First, an increase in price decreases the amount of goods that an individual can purchase. Even if after the price change the consumer wanted to consume the goods at the same ratio, he couldn't. Because of less income, the individual would buy less of both goods. Well, this is known as the income effect. Graphically, the income effect is the movement from one indifference curve to another, resulting from a price change, holding price ratios constant. Well, why are we holding prices constant? Because we're isolating the income effect resulting from a change in price. To do so, we identify the decline in the ability of the individual to purchase both goods by drawing a new budget line that's tangent to the lower indifference curve, but parallel to the original budget constraint. Second, price changes make substituting one good for another more attractive. Recall the consumer maximizing rule, which equalizes marginal utilities divided by prices. If the price of concerts increases, Charisse will have to derive more utility from the last concert she consumes. This occurs when she attends fewer concerts, so an increase in price also induces substitution from one good to another, and that's known as the substitution effect. Graphically, the substitution effect is the movement along the same indifference curve. Together, substitution and income effects make up the total effect from a price change. So the substitution effect plus the income effect is equal to the total effect. From A to B in this diagram is the income effect, and from B to C is the substitution effect. Let's review. We began this segment by discussing the problems of cardinality. Cardinal utility implies that utility is additive. When some economists argue that by redistributing income from the rich to the poor, we could increase social welfare, other economists cried foul. You can't objectively compare states of mind. This ushered in ordinal utility. So we no longer need to count utils. All we need to know is a person's preference ordering. Second, we noted, however, that cost-benefit analysis relies heavily on the idea of cardinal utility. Cost-benefit analysis is a frequently used attempt to assess whether a project should be undertaken. For example, what are the costs and benefits of setting aside 5 million acres of wilderness? Third, we introduced the concept of indifference curves to reflect individual preferences. At any point on an indifference curve, an individual is indifferent. A point on a higher indifference curve is preferred, and so on. Fourth, we reviewed the budget constraint, which defines what people can buy. Fifth, we applied the concepts of the indifference curves and the budget constraint to define consumer equilibrium. Equilibrium is defined where the budget line is tangent to an indifference curve. That's where the last dollar spent on one product gives the same level of satisfaction as the last dollar spent on another. Sixth, we derived a demand curve from a set of indifference curves, identifying the connection between utility and demand. And finally, we saw that a change in price has 2 effects, an income effect and a substitution effect. The sum of these 2 effects is the total effect of a price change.